Welcome to the module on the need and role of regulatory institutions for public welfare. As far as the concept of public welfare is concerned, it is a term used to denote the different tax-supported programs that provide cash assistance or services to individuals and families who are deemed eligible based on their income and assets. So basically, public welfare programs is one of the most populist programs of any government or state in a political framework. This is basically a kind of welfare-oriented programs which are supported by the tax funding, which is a compulsory payment by the citizens of the country, and also to provide the transfers or the cash assistance to those individuals and families who are eligible to receive based on certain criteria, either in terms of income or in terms of assets. Moreover, this type of public welfare programs are funded by the government or they are taken up in terms of some of the NGOs with the objective to address the major merit goods in a society, which comprises of food, housing, healthcare, childcare, among others. So most of the social welfare systems have certain eligibility requirements for individuals wishing to receive the financial support. And all these eligibility requirements call for an institutional framework to exist. And that is the designing of the policy needs to be done. And that can be done through the existence of a regulatory agency, whereby all these criteria are being stated and thereby the system can be operational. Moreover, it is said that in terms of social welfare program, there has been a role of regulatory bodies. So what are these? The role of regulatory bodies is to protect healthcare consumers from the health risk, a safe working environment for the healthcare professionals, and ensure that the public health and the welfare are served by the health programs. So in the domain of the health requirement as one of the most important merit good, all the developments, all the incentives, all the policies will be designed so that a safe working environment can be there. Regulation also refers to controlling human or societal behavior. This is very much important because how the human behavior or the social behavior can be controlled by rules or regulations or a rule of order issued by an executive authority or agency of a government having the force of law. So that means in terms of the state, in terms of the dominance of a state in any economy, regulation calls for the public interest, calls for addressing the needs of the society, and thereafter it has to be embedded by the law and the governance. The regulation covers all activities of private or public behavior that may be detrimental to societal or governmental interest, but its scope varies across the countries. So whenever there is any need for delivering any public goods, either it's basic education, health or social infrastructure, it is the regulation which takes care of that, which will address both the private and the public counterparts. This basically gets into what are the powers which are embedded to the regulatory agencies. So a regulatory agency which is funded by the state in most of the cases have certain powers to execute. The first power to execute is to oblige individuals or firms entering the industry to obtain a license. Because this license is basically a legal agreement or a kind of a trademark which the firms can operate. And this can be actually imposed by a regulatory body if it exists. So that requires a setting up of an organizational capital. Secondly, require transparency of information and decision making on part of a regulated company. That means a regulated company must disclose all the information and there should be transparency in its disclosures. This also calls for a good governance under which the regulatory body will operate or function. Thirdly, monitor the performance and investigate the compliance of the regulated company with the regulator publishing the findings of his investigations. This calls for proper auditing. So any kind of firm or company which needs to be licensed, either for the private interest or public interest, requires a routine exercise of auditing in terms of documentation of the records in order to address accountability and transparency in its operations, and finally an auditor's report needs to be placed. That will be the role of a regulatory agency to function in any particular economy or society. Now we come on to the purpose of regulatory agency. So what is the sole purpose of these agencies? Firstly is to protect the health, safety and property of the public. So it is repeatedly said that the public interest is one of the most important interests from a state point of view, where health, safety and property. Health in terms of the health programs, safety in terms of the law and order, and property in terms of the land and the other property rights that they want to emphasize. So in a free market economy, many sectors need no regulatory oversight because they self-regulate. So whenever we refer to a free market economy, that the regulations are not there because the liberal moves are there. Substandard products or services are forced out of the market when customers take the business elsewhere. So it is seen that in a free market, without any regulations, without any monitoring, without any surveillance, any kind of inefficiencies or corruption can come up because the products may not be there or products can be exchanged in an informal market setup. All these activities can be checked by the existence of a regulatory body. The primary purpose of most of the regulatory agencies is to ensure that individuals and the public at large are not subject to any form of risk, and so that which will be created because of the lack of knowledge. So regulatory agencies should not encourage any kind of asymmetric information between the producers and the consumers. Every individual should be given the right to access to proper and complete information, and that is also one of the ways by which the policies and the statements and the disclosures to be done. Regulations help to boost up the public confidence that the individual business has met a minimum standard. So regulators also will provide some incentives, also will provide some encouragement to the firms or the companies so that they have met some standard and there is scope for further improvement. This comes in what are the functions of the regulators in a state-oriented economy which needs for the role of a state welfare-oriented society. The first function refers to protection of public interest. Because here public interest means social maximization or social welfare maximization, that is taking care of the safety, taking care of the political stability and also the basic needs of the individuals like food, clothing, shelter and others. Monitoring compliance with contractual obligations to the government and other legal and regulatory requirements. So any kind of legal norms, any kind of compliance that also must be met by the regulators. Establishing technical, safety and quality standards. This is very much important because a regulator has to set up a standard, and that standard has to be acquired or has to be achieved by the firms which are licensed or by the capitalist owners that are in place. So this type of standards and safety and technicalities is a role of a regulator to ensure efficiency in the market or efficiency in the society. And also monitoring the compliance on a day-to-day basis. That means proper monitoring, surveillance and auditing that also calls for. Imposing penalties for non-compliance. This is a very important term in the form of an auditing perspective, that any kind of non-compliance means not following the norms, not satisfying the standards, not satisfying the rules, that particular firm can come under the penalty. So this is basically a kind of a punishment or a kind of a threat that can be given in order to ensure a function in an efficient mode. Further, it is said that regulators can also administer tariff adjustments and periodic reviews. Because tariff adjustment in terms of import tax, whereby the tax can be modified or adjusted, and periodic reviews of the functioning. Establishing accounting standards, undertaking the performance analysis, facilitating dispute resolution between the parties. This is also very much important in order to address the conflict that can arise or emerge in any society. Providing advice and counsel to the government on policy matters and other related matters. That means any kind of advisory role the regulatory agencies can perform, and thereby they can administer to its fullest. Now we come up to the modern version of regulatory agency as we observe in today's world. This is typically termed as IRA or Independent Regulatory Agency. So independent regulatory agency in a democratic set of government is designed to promote independence and autonomous in the functioning. The concept of autonomous comes in when they are given freedom to operate but under a kind of a scanner. And this scanner will be basically done by the regulatory agency, but they are free to operate in an autonomous mode. So during the last 2.5 decades, a modern nation state has undergone a unprecedented metamorphosis in respect of its structures and process of governance. So this is basically the process of transformation, which says that any kind of governance, any kind of modernization also calls for freedom, also calls for autonomy, but not at the cost of no regulations, because a surveillance, a monitoring needs to be done from time to time basis. A new version of the state called regulated state has added a new perspective on governance, because this is basically a state which is given autonomy but under regulations to a certain extent, is also defining a new dimension of governance. This also takes care of a decrease in the state involvement and new approaches to contract, to control out of the services or public-private partnerships. So the concept of PPP model, that is public-private partnership model, which has come up in the business world and also in the merit goods and also in the priority sectors of the economy, is because of giving autonomy but under a direct surveillance or monitoring of an agency. Creation of executive and regulatory agencies to support the process of separating policy making from day-to-day activity in government departments and between department and service providers. That means the functions needs to be segregated. The functions needs to be streamlined and rationalized. So one of the function can be executive agency or executive department, or can be a regulatory body. So all of this must be in place with a proper flowchart, with a proper hierarchical system, so that the efficiencies can come up in the market and proper specialization occurs in the activities. And that is how we can come up with a single window clearance system under the regulatory agency. Now, as an example of independent regulatory agency, we can cite it from the globe of the Thatcher government in Britain, is posited as the first government outside the USA to create regulatory agencies. Because this was followed from the conservative government's decision to privatize previously public-owned utilities, notably British Telecom and British Gas. That means the notion of privatization itself drives in the policy of autonomy, the policy of managerial freedom and decision making in its functioning. The paradoxical result was that the Conservatives' government's ambition to deregulate and liberalize the utility market resulted in re-regulation and creation of what became new and powerful regulatory actors. So this is the irony of the process, because even if the autonomy is given to them, but in the long run, because of the regulatory agencies, they have monitored, they have done the surveillance jobs, and this has ended up with a re-regulatory body, which was basically not within the principles of economic liberalization. So decade of 1980s witnessed accelerated reforms and restructuring of the sector in the UK and USA. So within the restructuring process, all these policies of disinvestment or privatization has come up, where managerial autonomy was being granted to these agencies so that they can function at their own whims, but under the surveillance of the factor or of any regulated body. Now we come on to the functions of independent regulatory authority. Three functions can be highlighted. Firstly, the very norm of prevention of market failure, because market failure is a result of asymmetric information or unbiased information between the two parties. Secondly, removal of anti-competitive practices. So any kind of anti-competitive practices means only benefiting the private interest, giving rise to monopoly power or capitalist classes, that needs to be avoided. And promotion of public interest, that is one of the notion of a welfare state. And that is how a welfare state is being defined. Now we move on to the functions of IRA one by one. The first function refers to prevention of market failure. As we say that market failure is a condition or a state of affairs in which market fails to allocate resources efficiently to maximize social welfare. This can be due to a number of factors. It can be due to the imperfections in the market. One of the sources, price discrimination. One of the sources, full information among the buyers and the sellers, which may be lacking. Or it can be due to some kind of resistance in the market due to political dominance or due to any kind of political conflicts. So this is where the market does not function, price mechanism fails, and that calls for an external agency to interfere. Market failures occur in the provision of public goods. So basically in the provision of public goods, market failure is being seen, and in case of natural monopolies or asymmetric information or in presence of externality where price does not capture the total cost of the society. A natural monopoly occurs when entire market is more efficiently served by one firm than by two or more firms. That means it is said under increasing returns to scale that if two or more firms started as competitors but eventually they merge to a single firm, then that will enjoy natural monopoly over a longer period of time. And thereby market failure will take place, and that will basically dictate the terms which will be the end of market failure or basically the question of price mechanism. So this is where the regulatory body will come up and interfere. The second function also comes up under the market failure is that natural monopolies enjoy some scale benefits. They actually want to expand their size of production. Average cost of output becomes higher, multiple firms come in, and their regulation may be necessary to protect the consumer interest because in most of the cases the product will be high priced or prices will be skyrocketing. So because of the skyrocketing price, regulation is very much necessary to impose so that it might provide an hindrance from the entry of the new firms or it can protect the monopoly status. So examples include water distribution and railway lines, whereby regulation is coming up as one of the most important steps to protect the consumer's interest. The second function refers to the removal of anti-competitive practices. It is said that under the anti-competitive practices, some kind of policies can be imposed by the regulatory agencies such as price fixing or market sharing or basically checking the monopoly power. This is because by price fixing we mean that the rise in the prices can be checked or controlled by imposing a maximum price that can be charged for the product. Even if when we go for market sharing, large number of firms can enter, but they will jointly enjoy the total profit, and thereby market sharing model is a cooperative model. So most of the cases, in case of the IRA, the laws will empower the officials to take action so that practices can be prohibited. So regulation through a set of transparent, consistent and non-discriminatory rules. This is very important because a regulation has to be transparent because all the disclosures must be there, consistent in the sense that it has to be taken up for a consistent period of time, and there should not be any possibility of discrimination like favoring one group at the cost of other. Then only a competitive and a dynamic environment can be set where the market players can enjoy or can persist. So that is how the IRA comes in place and totally checks up the situation. The third function of IRA refers to the promotion of public interest. It is not only looking to the private interest or private firms or companies, it also has a notion of welfare state, that is the promotion of public interest. So by public interest, we mean by any kind of government subsidy programs which can be cash or in kind. For example, the support pricing which is done in the agricultural sector to provide financial assistance to the farmers so that the government can purchase the buffer stock. Public distribution system ensuring the food security and also the grain security by selling the food at a lower price through the rationing model. Free distribution of water and power to agriculture. So these are some of the regulatory decisions which are the key decisions in order to step out from the public interest and to benefit for the masses. Thereby comes in some of the regulatory bodies in India. Like one of the most important regulatory body is control fraud, which is the market regulators put systems in place to prevent the fraud, as financial customers are not always sophisticated to do themselves. That means some of the customers might not be well aware about the security laws or the security norms. So some kind of IRA in terms of fraud attacking or fraud checking can take place. Promote fairness. This can be done in some of the cases to go for an auditing so that the profit margin can be checked, which does not take away the extract from the markets, particularly the surpluses that should not be extracted from the markets. So laws also are there to take up for India's SEBI, Securities and Exchange Board of India, which will take care of the trading in securities. So any kind of malfunctioning, any kind of disruptions in the trading of the securities can be checked by the SEBI, which comes under a very, very prominent and one of the proactive regulatory agency in India, particularly in the capital market. So the question comes on about what can be the futuristic policies to ensure a welfare state within a regulatory framework. First and foremost, there is a need for a new administrative ethos of public management. Here, public management refers to the core area of public interest in terms of safety, in terms of security, and also in terms of inclusiveness. There is a need for a more structured, effective, concerted, and meaningful interface among the three major stakeholders. This is very much important because this calls for a communication, this calls for a dialogue, and this calls for an interactive mode between the three stakeholders, namely the state regulators, the civil society institutions, and the regulatory agency. And they should come up in a structured, effective, and a meaningful manner. They need to work together to promote the public interest. This is very important because public interest is the motto, so they have to work together. It's a mutual process calling for civil society organizations to act freely, and regulators have to make themselves more accessible and receptive to the suggestions. This is very much important from the regulator's point of view, that they have to follow the compliance, they have to agree to the norms, and also they have to be interactive in the process. This basically goes into the saying that there should not be any kind of dictatorship or dominance of regulatory agencies over the society, because they have to take the mutual interest and maintain a symbiotic relation between all the stakeholders in the society. So basically in this module, we conceptualize on the concept of public welfare. Public welfare is basically a government action taking as a support programs which are funded by the state for the public interest as well as for the private motives. A regulatory agency must be in place to check and balances the monopoly power, any kind of inefficiencies that are arising, or any sort of disruptions. There is a need to set up an independent regulatory authority or IRA which will take up the decision-making process and also will act on an efficient grounds. Example of IRA has been taken up in terms of the British, also in Indian context, in terms of SEBI and other regulatory bodies which are there. For example, the Regulatory Development Authority or Insurance Authority, all of them look after the norms. And the futuristic policies calls for a better designed, well-framed and a constructive regulatory policy so that all the stakeholders in the society can act freely without any dominance of an agency or dominance of any one of the classes. Then only the economy of the society will have a safer and a fruitful and a conducive environment to survive.